Good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here tonight. We are honored this evening to have Reverend Fletcher Harper with us, who will be talking about moral power and the living planet, why religions matter. I want to make note, before I turn the floor over to Reverend Harper, that this program has been made possible by the Southwest Florida RESET Center. Full disclosure, I am a board member of the RESET Center, but it was not me who made this event happen. I went to the RESET Center with a request for help to come up with a truly special program that would go along with Right to Clean Water's centering on stewardship campaign. And so what did they do? They went out and got for everybody here tonight a pioneer of the global religious environmental movement, who has helped spearhead the faith-based fossil fuel divestment movement, organizes faith turnouts at major climate mobilizations, and is a co-founder of SHINE, an international campaign that supports women and community-led renewable energy access initiatives in Africa and India. He is also the author of GreenFaith, Mobilizing God's People to Protect the Earth. A little bit about the RESET Center. It formed within the first few months of the pandemic. You'll recall when the entire world seemed to come to almost a standstill, and all of a sudden we saw greenhouse gas emissions plummet, and we saw sky smog, and people were seeing mountains that they hadn't seen in decades, and polluted waters were clearing. And at that time, there was a lot of calls around for us to press that reset button and correct those systems that needed correcting and start to build a better world. RESET's intention is to reset human impact on the natural world with a focus on climate and a focus on water through an avenue of eco-spirituality. And so I think if I tell you a little bit more about GreenFaith, you will also know a lot more about Reverend Harper. So GreenFaith, this is its vision. We envision a world transformed in which humanity in all its diversity has developed a shared reverence for life on Earth. Religious spiritual communities everywhere generate a moral awakening to the sacredness of Earth and the dignity of all people. Together, we are building resilient, caring communities and economies that meet everyone's needs and protect the planet. The era of conquest, extraction, and exploitation has given way to cooperation and community. The good life is one of connectedness with each other and of all nature. It is a world of flourishing life that replaces despair with joy, scarcity with shared abundance, and privilege with justly distributed power. GreenFaith's mission is to build a worldwide multi-faith climate and environmental movement. Its theory of change is that we have an opportunity now for bold transformation to build a life connected to each other and the earth. Our faith and spiritual practices give us the strength to turn towards great challenges and to profoundly change the world. People of faith have done so before when there was a call to action, and members of the GreenFaith community are choosing to do so now. So I will stop talking and hand the floor over to Reverend Fletcher Harper.
Thanks, Joe. And it's really nice to be with all of you, and thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate it. I'm excited about the work that all of you are doing. I've got a little bit of late season hay fever, so if you hear my voice catching, that's what's going on. And what I'd like to do is to talk for 20 to 25 minutes and then have plenty of time for back and forth and for questions and discussion. Earlier this morning, I was...
Excuse me, Fletcher, one moment. Holly, my screen is saying that the recording is paused.
We're still recording, and we've spotlighted Fletcher for the recording, but we are still recording. I don't know why
Okay.
it says it's paused for you. So
Yeah,
continue on.
it's showing that it's recording for me too.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Let's go then.
Good. So I was on a call early this morning with several colleagues in Nigeria, where we've got a half dozen green faith circles that are grassroots people of Muslim and Christian and different tribal backgrounds and persuasions. And they've come together because the government and major international fossil fuel companies there are drilling for as much oil and gas as they possibly can, disrupting the lives and the lands of local farmers, polluting the water, fouling the air, and flaring gas at all hours of the day, which is unbelievably loud and disruptive, as well as putting a huge amount of toxic pollution into the air that's terrible for the health of local communities. What's interesting to me is that this has been going on for upwards of 25 to 30 years, and that what's different at this stage is that religious people, people from a pretty diverse range of religious and spiritual backgrounds, are motivated to meet together, to work together, to explore what their religions teach about these things, but they're not stopping there. They're then taking their faiths, they're getting up out of their pews, off the prayer rugs, they're going into the streets to protest. They're speaking directly to the media. They are demonstrating outside of government offices. And this is in a country where there's a very mixed history of respect for human rights and civil rights and rights to public assembly and that sort of thing. So they're taking action and real risks because of what they believe. So how did we get here? How did we get to this point where all of a sudden, and we see this around the world, there is without question this global spiritual, moral, religious awakening about what we're doing to the planet and about the fact that it's utterly unworkable and that it's utterly wrong. I think a couple of things have happened. One is that the issues and their impacts are getting unavoidable. We've seen over the last couple of years that most of our work is in the area of climate change, but you could draw the same comparisons in relationship to toxic exposures, in relationship to different issues related to water. The impacts and the harm that they're causing to people are just impossible to ignore at this point. And the seriousness of them is equally impossible to ignore. You can't ignore when wildfires are affecting hundreds of millions of people around the world. You can't ignore it. A couple of 100 miles west from you all recently, after a massive rainfall, Jackson, Mississippi lost the ability to provide clean drinking water to its entire population. You see these types of impacts at much, much greater scale than ever before. And there's a moment now when people are taking a step back and they're shocked and they're stunned by this, as they should be. And I think that is one reason that we're seeing religious and spiritual groups, and I think even more importantly than religious and spiritual groups' involvement is the clear moral existential reality of these issues is now coming front and center, and that's creating an opportunity for religious groups to get involved. So I think impact is one thing to keep in mind. A second thing that's happened is that it's been 20 to 25 years now that there's been a concerted movement among the religious and spiritual communities of the world to start first to surface these issues, and then secondly, to prioritize them. And I don't need to tell you all that, at least from our perspective, religious groups have been slow on the uptake with this. There have been some communities in the US, the Unitarian Universalists, I think they're, deserve particular praise for their sort of quick recognition of the seriousness of these issues. But by and large, religious groups have, yes, offered good teachings, yes, issued statements that nail the issues and the theologies pretty decently, but have not made these issues a top priority. That's started to change because of 25 years of diligent, committed organizing work by groups like GreenFaith and Interfaith Power and Light, and and lots of other groups. I mean, we see this all over the world. There are these small, committed bands of people who care about their faith, care about their spirituality, want their religious or spiritual community to have some integrity when it comes to religious and spiritual issues, and have stuck with it over the years. So you've got this moment now where there's increasingly visible public impacts and a movement that has started to grow up and to mature, still has a long way to go. And I think the third thing that we see as a motivating factor in this nexus between religion and spirituality and the environment is the surfacing of what we all think of as the uncomfortable emotions. People are, my experience is that when I talk to people about these issues, when I ask them what motivates them, they are frightened. They are disgusted with the lack of progress over the last 20, 30 years. They're angry because they feel that government and industry leaders have really failed pretty miserably to fulfill their responsibilities in this regard, usually for reasons that aren't hard to discern. It's greed, it's profit seeking. And there's we've reached a sort of a fed up point with that. The most visible expression of that has been in the youth movements around these issues, the Fridays for Future and that family of actions. There's another global climate strike that's happening tomorrow. But that reaching that point is not at all limited to youth. So tomorrow, we have a new GreenFaith chapter in Japan. Japanese culture, as many of you know, is extraordinarily reticent when it comes to public protest or direct confrontation. It's just not at all the Japanese cultural way. And I've met and got started working with a gentleman in his mid-60s named Yoshiro Sada. Sada-san has been a member of a Japanese Shinto-like community for many, many years. He grows enormous amounts of vegetables. Every time I talk to him on the phone, he's got another bucket full of fresh veggies that he's grown in his garden. He absolutely does not think of himself as an activist. And in Japan, activism is a bit of a dirty word. And a lot of younger people, if they do take part in any kind of public demonstration or protest, will actually hide their faces because they don't want their families to see that they've been involved in that kind of action because they feel that it might bring embarrassment or shame to their families because of the public stigma around activism. And they also are afraid that corporations might not hire them to work because corporations, when they hire, don't like to see that people are activists or involved in that kind of work. I'm giving all of this background because over a period of several months, Yoshiro, or Yoshi as he goes by, worked with us to identify about 100 different Japanese people from different religions and spiritualities who came together for an online conference. I did a sort of inception mission trip to Japan and worked with him and with several other climate groups for a couple of weeks. And we organized 2 educational study tours to go visit coal plants in Japan and to learn about the problems that they're creating in their communities as well as for the climate. And Yoshi met with a couple of people who are organizing demonstrations and marches and that sort of thing. And at the time that my time in Japan was coming to an end, I said to him, "What do you think needs to come next?" And out of the blue, he said, "I think that we need to organize people to go to the climate strike in September." Now, I think that he's going to be going with 3 or 4 people, but this is a big deal. And what it shows to me and what it reveals to me is a pattern that I've seen over and over in the work that we do around the world, that Yoshi would not describe himself as an activist. He wouldn't describe himself as angry, but he's profoundly concerned about what's happening. And because of that, he's willing to take steps further forward than he ever would have previously in his life. And I believe that there are millions and millions of people like that in the world. So the question is, how do people move from that level of passive concern into willing to act publicly? We've seen that there are several factors that matter. One is there needs to be a really clear presentation of what's at stake that does not pull any punches, that does, and that I see, Rhonda, I see your question. Japanese spiritual leaders for years have been very strong advocates against nuclear power because of Hiroshima. And I would even say that they've provided, I think, very important leadership with that. The challenge now is to get them to transition into this next generation of issues to start taking on climate change as one of several issues. What we find, gets people like Yoshi from that place of passive concern into public action is, first of all, relationship building. People take action because they're connected to people, and the process of building relationships and public relationships, as the community organizing world talks about, where you say, why do you care about these issues? Most people have never been asked why they care about the right to clean water, the right to a stable climate, or just broadly the environment. It's really an important thing to give people that chance to reflect personally on why they care. And religious and spiritual communities have a real opportunity to do that. I think that one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of climate and environmental organizations and campaigns make is they believe if they explain rationally and factually what the issues are, that a light will go off in people's minds and people will say, okay, I'm going to start devoting a lot of time to this. And I don't need to tell all of you that that's just not the way that people work. What does work is if you engage people and say, why do you care? Who are you? What are you about? What matters most to you? That gets into people's hearts and minds in a way that facts simply don't. A mentor of mine many years ago wrote an article that was sort of snarkily titled, "You're right, so what?" And I think it gets to this sort of thing of, if we want to build powerful public moral movements around these issues, which obviously we all on this call do, that it's not enough to be right. We need to build these kinds of relationships. I think the second thing that people need, in addition to those relationships, is they need an invitation to participate in something that's new and beyond their normal sphere of experience. And they need someone who's willing to accompany them in that moment. It's very difficult. There was a fascinating study done, I think 7 or 8 years ago now, that showed that upwards of 45% of the people who currently attend pro-life or anti-abortion demonstrations, actually, when they came into that movement, were on the fence about abortion rights or not. And what got them engaged was, first of all, people building a relationship with them, and then secondly, people inviting them to participate in actions that they themselves had never participated in, and that they were even a little bit ambivalent about, but they took part because they felt an increasing sense of group identity because of the conversations that I've mentioned. Now, I want to be really clear that I believe it's really wrong to instrumentalize people in that kind of way. And I also want to be really clear that there are some people, and there's clearly, I think, at least 25 to 30% of the public religious population is extraordinarily conservative and fundamentalist around these issues, will not change, and that it's neither useful or wise to spend a lot of time trying to engage with them and to try to convert them. It took me the better part of 15 years to learn that, but there is a real segment of the faith community. It's for sure in the United States, but it's also true in a lot of other major countries. Brazil, we see in many parts of the Muslim world, particularly the Gulf states, where there's a substantial overlap between fundamentalist or extremist religious groups, extractive industries, and authoritarian government. We've seen that pattern clearly with the Trump situation in the United States, but it's a global pattern. And from our perspective, the role of movements like the ones that you all are organizing in Florida is not to try to convert or make nice falsely with groups like that, but to be able to say very directly, in a self-possessed kind of way, these are issues that involve our deepest and most fundamental moral values. And we have a strong disagreement with any group, civic, political, business, religious, or otherwise, that thinks that destroying the supply of water or poisoning it to the extent that it threatens the well-being of communities is fundamentally wrong. So we think that sort of taking and notice, I didn't use, I alluded to a very well disguised scientific reality within that argument, but the argument was not at all made on scientific or policy grounds. It was made fundamentally on moral grounds. And to say to people, this is a choice between right and wrong. And you can argue that choice, but you cannot pretend that it's not what it's about. And if you believe that that the government giving municipalities, businesses, anybody the right to destroy access to clean water, that's okay, if you argue that that's the case, then I would just full stop disagree on moral grounds. And just to sort of put, and obviously, I don't know the details of the issue about, water in Florida. You all do, but it's easy enough to sort of have some, build a basic case around that. But I think, for, again, back to the comparison of the development of our relationship with Yoshi, he benefited from hearing from climate and environmental groups that could explain clearly what the scientific basis was. Ultimately, for him, what mattered most was being able to say, I know enough, I know what's happening, I believe this is a question of right or wrong, and I want to stand up for what's right. And for him, the end game was not to try to turn him into a mini scientist that that was going to make an argument publicly based largely on scientific principles, but rather to equip him, in his case as a Shinto, to say, I believe that there's a sacredness to this planet. I believe that what we're doing to it is wrong, and I'm going to stand up because of that. I see the comment about water as a spiritual element. I mean, every religion in the universe has water as a sacred element. And it's an interesting question in terms of this may be, I mean, when we were preparing for this, and Joe and I were talking, and we discovered that we're both sort of New Yorkers at heart. I think that we've done some research about what types of narratives work effectively with religious and spiritual people and communities. And water absolutely is a spiritual element. What we've found in terms of how to communicate most effectively is that it's very important to present people with two alternatives, one that's right and one that's wrong. And what I have found in a strange way is that I'm trying to think of the right way to say this. We try more and more, and I'm not suggesting that this was what the question was about, that it's simply what it triggered in my mind. We find that we try to stay more and more away from spiritualizing these issues and to talk about, this is about the life and the well-being of people, particularly the most vulnerable, but this is about a fundamental human right, and that there is a real question of right or wrong. And to the degree that we would bring spiritual or religious rituals into the mix, we would say, look, religions have understood this for years, because who wants to be baptized in a bunch of toxic or polluted water? Would you baptize your infant son or daughter or child in water that you knew was toxic? That's part of what this is about. So I would bring it in that kind of way, connected very directly with making it impossible for people to engage around. You want people to have to make a choice. You want people to have to be made uncomfortable with that choice. That was one of the, I think, great values and services that the fossil fuel divestment movement played. And look, that movement emerged in the wake of the failed Copenhagen climate negotiations, when the climate movement was really sort of back to square one, didn't know how to get public traction on the issue. And the genius of a divestment campaign, just like the genius of what you all are doing, is that it puts the question to people in a, this may not be very 2022 to use this word in this way, but in a very binary way. You got to answer yes or no, and you shouldn't expect that people are going to arrive at an answer immediately. You should hope that the question makes people uncomfortable for a period of time. because once you get into that extended stage of discomfort, then that's a big step towards building the kind of cultural momentum that will help you win. Let me, I realize I've been rambling a little bit. Let me share a couple of thoughts as I'd reflected on this about the ways in which I would approach and engage with religious and spiritual communities in Florida. And then would love to go back and forth and hear thoughts, questions, agreements, disagreements, whatever. So you all have a petition that's tailor-made for engaging with religious and spiritual communities. I would try to get some good standard presentation materials together and try to speak at religious and spiritual communities across the state and invite people to sign the petition. And to make clear, I think, Joe, I think you said you have to get to 220,000 or something like that. I would say we can do this and your help matters. And I would, try to get to people after services. A lot of congregations still do, coffee hour or the equivalent, and make short presentations during the service or after, and try to do the signatures. But then I would also follow up and have periodic meetings to sort of report on the progress of the signatures. How are you going to collect more, involve people in signature drives? I would get some, invite congregations to do a water Sunday or a water Saturday or whatever their day of ritual or prayer or observance or worship is. I could dig up some stuff that we developed years ago around that. You all probably, a lot of groups have developed resources to support that, but what's missing from a lot of those resources is the direct public action request that you all have. So I would, put that out there. But I would work the recruitment. I would work, I would invite clergy to give a sermon and give them some talking points to work with. Clergy, like many clergy, do like to preach or speak about these issues, but they need some help developing, and they can pull in the scriptural and theological things. What they need help on is, why does this issue matter so much? What's the impact that people are feeling? I think sharing stories of how communities have been already in Florida negatively impacted by water pollution, water shortages, that sort of thing. And I know that there have been, in Florida, obviously there are impacts on the economy, which are huge, as well as on health and people's well-being. But I would try to tell specific stories about communities that suffer, and people and households and schools or whatever that suffer because of lack of access to water. 4 or 5 years ago, up in Newark, New Jersey, closer to where I live, after the Flint, Michigan water issue, there was a discovery, because Newark is an old, poor, largely Black city. They discovered that they had elevated lead levels in the water there, and sharing those direct stories of impact really drives it home to people. And I think I would try to identify your 3 or 4 or 5 stories that you can share, and stories of impact are what work best in religious and spiritual communities. We saw with climate change for years, you could talk about certain numbers of parts per million, and you'd get some people on board with that. But when you talk about drought affecting this community and driving them off their land and turning them into climate refugees, that resonates a lot more, because it's real people being unjustly impacted. So those are, I think the severe storm thing, and I would be ready with stories of impact. I would imagine that there are drought seasons or times of the year in Florida. I would be ready to communicate about that with religious and spiritual communities, saying, look, here we are again. Once again, we're facing a drought season. Once again, there's not enough water to grow crops. Whatever the impacts are, this is morally wrong. That's why we're calling for religious communities around Florida to support this right. Think about that, sort of how you tell the story. I think that maybe, I think maybe because I don't know in great detail about the work that you all are doing, it might be good if I stopped, and I'd love to hear from you all in terms of questions or comments or just thinking together about, how you all see anything that I've said or see religious communities as being relevant to your work. I mean, obviously, Florida's got a very large fundamentalist Christian population that has been hugely problematic on climate change, and I'm sure they've not been terribly helpful around this issue. But I'd love to hear what you all are thinking and go back and forth a little bit.
Everybody, you can just raise your hand visually or electronically. You can write your question into the chat, or I think you could just ask your question.
Yeah, just ask. I think there's the advantage. I mean, or do whatever you want, but
well then, Reverend Harper, I have a question to make sure I understand at least one of the points that you're making. In appealing to congregations, religious people, we shouldn't focus on making a spiritual case. Make a moral case, and their spirituality will kick in and say, okay, we have to act on this. Is that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, that's what I will say is that's GreenFaith's approach. I think it's an Irish saying, and Joe, again, having grown up around New York, you may have heard this: is this a private fight, or can anybody get involved? And I think what you want to say is this is like, I think that the moral emotions that get people up off their couches and into the streets or into the voting booths are anger, fear, disgust. I mean, it's all of these things we think of as negative emotions. And if people are not reacting with those emotions to the current state of the environment, then there's a missing link, because a natural, healthy human reaction to the destruction of the planet is to feel that kind of revulsion and to be motivated to act. So there will be plenty of, now I will be very clear, Buddhist leaders would take considerable exception to what I just said, because for Buddhist practitioners, avoiding, anger is an enormous danger. I would suggest that reckoning with the level of frustration and, like I said, fear and anger is what motivates people on this. I'm not suggesting that we all become, rageaholics about it, but I do think that channeling that reality is necessary at this stage. So I think that, to me, I think that's fundamental to how you approach this stuff. And certainly there are ways to say, of course, we're grateful for the miracle of water and of life on this planet. Of course, we find awe and wonder in the face of a world, a universe that is so spectacular, so majestic, so awe-inspiring. And that's why we're so fed up with all of the things that are going on that are destroying it. And it's why we want those to stop, because there is something that's so spectacular that's at stake and that's being desecrated.
Mary Tracy, a question?
It's more a comment. I am a Buddhist, Fletcher, and I understand what you were saying. I do. And one thing that's kind of impacted me as I've gotten involved with this work is that one thing Buddhists at least say we wish is that all living beings will be liberated. But when we consider liberation as being only human, we're leaving out an awful lot of other living beings. And I'm learning, I'm becoming to feel even closer that water, like us, is a living being. And as we ignore it and let it continue to be desecrated, we are not liberating the living being water. And that is something that this isn't something Buddhist, but I mean, it's something that we all need to address. So yeah, I agree. And I totally agree with your suggestion about stories, because there's nothing like stories to connect people. And I think your colleague, Maria, because Holly and the Reset people had a wonderful presentation by her about using stories from different religious faiths to kind of spur people into getting concerned about the water. So thank you. And I'm really appreciating your talk tonight. Thank you so much.
Yeah, people are wonderfully helpless in the face of a story. I mean, it really is fascinating how we're unable to disengage from them. And I, Mary Tracy, I think what what you raised about, and this wasn't the word you said, but this sort of otherworldly tendency in religion, it's a big problem. I mean, that's what a lot, from my perspective, and I hope if I'm offending anybody, you'll speak up, because I'm sort of hopelessly blunt about this stuff. But I think that's one of the biggest problems at the born again Christian movement. It's like, I'm old enough, I'll date myself, but that amazing movie that Robert Duvall produced years ago, The Apostle, where he's an itinerant preacher, and the opening scene is he's driving along a highway and a car has flipped off the road and is, had a horrible accident, and a person is dying in the front seat, and he runs down the side, and you think he's running down to pull the guy out of the car, and he gets to the window of the car and he looks into the eyes of this person and says, "Have you accepted Jesus?" And to me, that's a metaphor for, religion has to decide what kind of function it's going to play in the world at this point. I think that, I happen to think that if religion, got a lot more actively involved on these issues, it would refine a purpose for itself. I happen to think that a lot of religion is carried out in a sort of mindlessly ritualistic way and is purposeless and is not helpful. It's a good thing that I made a career as an activist, and I was 10 years inside of organized religious communities, and I value them, and I think they have a big role to play, but I don't think they're anywhere close to active enough. And I think the ones that have been most active have often been most active in the reactionary or highly conservative way that's just brought the world to the brink. So,
Wendy, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying this talk very much, and I appreciate what Mary Tracy just said too. That was really nice. So to kind of take what you're saying, I have a few questions that kind of bring it back to a little bit about some things that are happening in Florida here, but I hate to switch gears. I'd like to maybe take from that energy and apply it to these very real problems. Like, I think in a lot of ways, religion has been used to kind of conquer and extract. And so we're looking at that in a different form now with like overdevelopment and privatization, and in the name of like profit and capitalism, or coming to face that decision, like you're saying, and what's your real motive of anyone's mission is that self-reflection. Here in Fort Lauderdale anyway, it's like probably the most left-leaning area of the state, but even with those kinds of leaders, like we still have such aging infrastructure, which is what you're referring to, that happens everywhere, and that's perpetuated by the overdevelopment. So that's a separate issue from what I see happening, but related is, so they neglect the infrastructure as things are built in a very unsustainable way, not in harmony. And then when things fall apart, and in Fort Lauderdale, we had almost 300 million gallons of sewage in a river within a couple of months. And our drinking water is a separate issue where the filtration methods that they use create toxic byproducts, and they tell people it's safe. And now they're trying to privatize it. And that's what I see is happening, is that infrastructure is neglected. It's almost abused, because then it can be privatized in different ways. But then the environment and the people, the most disenfranchised people, suffer. So just how you see the unstoppable growth with that conquistador, the conquest mindset, but then also trying to do the opposite of rights of nature and to privatize those things. So thank you. Sorry for the long question, but I'm really, really enjoying hearing from you. Thank you.
That's great. I mean, having heard Mary Tracy and you, Wendy, talk, you all don't need me. I mean, you're all totally on. I mean, I think the problem, or I think whether it's a problem or an opportunity, is I don't think that people of faith, a lot of people of faith, are thinking the kinds of things that you both said, but don't feel that there's a forum or a place to say that directly and publicly. But when people say it, there's a lot of nodding heads. So I think that, and not all, I mean, there's some people that don't like hearing that for one reason or another. But I think that, I mean, having heard both of you speak, I was compelled by what you said. So I think that the thing is, and how do you put it out there and, start to communicate? I mean, communication matters a lot around this stuff. And also people being able to be direct and being able to speak with a kind of conviction that you both just did. So I think it's really important to put it out there. I think that there's a recognition, and I think, Wendy, what you said, like, there's a fundamental choice we've got to make. Are we going to have, nowhere in the world has water been privatized successfully and provided to the population. There are a number of places in the world, quite a lot, where government has taken, where society has decided this is a fundamental right, government needs to invest in it, and the system needs to be maintained properly. And there's a choice that we have to make. So I don't know. I feel like I should sign up for the communications class that you all should offer.
Carl, you have your hand up?
Yeah, so I grew up in Maryland on the Chesapeake Bay, and I watched the Chesapeake Bay from a kid to early adulthood suffer the impacts of farming and industrialization. And then I couldn't wait to get to Florida. I had the luck of 27 years in the Florida Keys right out of college. And over my 35 plus years here in Florida, I've watched this degradation go on again. But we have 330,000 people a year moving to Florida that are buying the Chamber of Commerce dream of blue water and clear blue skies. And they're buying the dream. They're coming to dream, and breaking through to the awareness of what's actually they're buying into is extremely difficult. And how we break through that number one problem of lack of awareness is, I think, our biggest issue to address. And we've been working on it for a couple of years now. It just seems our message is not getting out there to the way it needs to get out there. So, using the religious-based communities is a good way to do that. But I'm not sure even that is going to be enough to change this perception of what the people are coming to Florida for. And somehow we need to get through to them.
You all need to do a video. I mean, you all are really, I mean, I think what every single thing that you all have said is just so right on target and invites people to reflect. I mean, Carl, I think it's a good, religious groups are absolutely no silver bullet with this stuff. They're not. And I think what we're talking about is, how do you build a movement that's large enough? And religious and spiritual people are going to be part of that. But to me, there's a question of how do you communicate about this thoughtfully and engagingly, and each of the three of you, Mary Tracy and Wendy and you, Carl, have each spoken about different dimensions of this in ways to me that are really genuinely compelling. And I think that there are a number of people, not everybody, but there are a number of people, if they, heard you, Carl, say, look, how do you, even raising that question is just very effective as a communication strategy, because a lot of people get it. A lot of people get this stuff and they just haven't had the chance or the place to be invited to consider it. And I heard and felt the sense of sadness in what you were saying also, Carl. It's like, I've seen this before. I don't want to see it again. And we've got to reckon with this somehow. I don't, and I think also none of us, I think things are going to get considerably worse before they get better with all of these situations. It's certainly the case with climate change. My guess is that it's probably the case with the water issues too. And not to lose that ability to reflect as you all are doing about this, and to put that out there publicly.
Sharon Joy and then Mary Ann.
Yes, thank you. And welcome, Fletcher. I wanted to toss something back to you, and my thanks is you may not be aware of it, but you're one of the catalysts for what you're hearing today. Do you remember way back when at that evangelical church, I think it was Northland over in Orlando, and Russell Meyer asked you to come to the first gathering of the Florida Interfaith Climate Actions Network?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Well, we've been bouncing along for 6 years, telling some of the stories and getting together, networking, and we had to call it, I guess it was March the 6th. We were about to have our next gathering in Orlando, but COVID stepped up. So you are actually one of the reasons that we are doing what we're doing. So thank you, not only for Day, but way back when.
Well, I mean, I remember that, and I'm glad it helped. But there's something that's, there's something that's happening in the world. I mean, this is emerging all over the place. I mean, like I said earlier, these folks that we're working with in Nigeria, I mean, it's really humbling. I mean, these folks are relatively poor farmers. They are taking meaningful risk by getting involved in this stuff, but they're feeling this sense of that they have to, so I think that there's this moment where all of us are getting, whether it's God or the universe or whoever is asking all of us to, step up a little bit more.
Go ahead, Mary Ann.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for speaking to us very much. I found it to be very compelling that you offered that one of the solutions was for us to maybe establish a water Sunday, right? And I think that we could, and then either give the clergy talking points, or on the days that the clergy is not in the pulpit, like at the UU church, that's, one day a month. So have a traveling water show, and we could offer that if we, got enough people excited about it, and, just do a little bit of singing and a little bit of, where water comes from, and do that whole piece of really emphasizing, the good clean water and the really bad toxic water, and the contrast, and then work it that way. And we might have people that would do that. I think,
Sorry, go ahead. Well, I was going to say, having heard you all talk, given that everybody's gotten accustomed to, well, I think totally workable and good to do, get some clergy talking about this stuff. I also think you all could organize a You could do a Sunday late afternoon online multi-faith service. You know, and have several of you share stories. I mean, I want to hear more of what you all have to say. I mean, but I think, you know, if Mary Tracy and Carl and Wendy, for example, said what they said, you know, as brief reflect, I don't know, I just think that I think you all could do something that, and the advantage of that is that both the good and the hard thing of working with individual congregations is that it's by definition hyper local, and that's important. But as you're trying, you know, maybe if you did you could seed the ground by doing this sort of interfaith, online service or something like that, and invite people and put that out there and get Russell to put it out there through his email list or whatever, and we could put it out through our GreenFaith Florida email list or whatever, get a bunch of people to show up. And then at the end of that, you could say, you could do this in your own local mosque, synagogue, church. Here's some resources. I don't know. I mean, but I'm pretty impressed. I want to hear more from you all.
Thanks.
Gary?
Yes, I'm wondering about the effect of negative advertising. And I'm thinking maybe what we ought to do is do the video that you're talking about and make it readily available to people who are considering moving to Florida, and let them know what they're moving to. A government that just plain doesn't give a damn. And as long as it's in favor of what the homeowner, the property owner, and the corporations or farmers want, you know. So I'm thinking, you know, let them know that. The other thing is, I came up with a new Florida mascot, I guess we're going to call it, and it's the Florida state bird. It's the Florida canary, a manatee. A manatee is the canary in the state of Florida, having lost over 1,100 of them last year. You know, people will understand that. They will identify with that. And so I'm wondering if you, in your organization and around the world that you've seen, does that have an impact that would be helpful to make some changes?
You know, I think, I mean, what I would say is that there's certainly a there. I think what I would want to do would be to think about a communications strategy that would have a number of different components to it, and how the piece that you described or the pieces that you mentioned could fit into that. To me, there's you know, I could see it being very provocative, you know, sort of an open letter from, you know, concerned people to everybody who's thinking about moving to Florida. You know, I think that the thing that you want to do, though, what I would say is not just stick it to your governor, but also give what's the call to action? You know, what is it that you want people to do?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that would be, I would look for, you know, what's the bad thing that needs to be dismantled, and what's the thing that you want people to do.
Yeah,
Well,
because
our call
you
to action
mentioned,
is for them to sign our petition.
yeah,
But
you mentioned,
we have 1 minute left. Carl has had his hand up, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time, especially Fletcher's. So, Carl, you have the last question.
Yeah, just, it's not a question, just building off of Gary's comment about negative publicity advertising. You know, we all grew up with the Native American paddling down, you know, a river with the pollution and the tear in the eye. You know, something like that could be very impactful if we wrapped it around the, if you haven't seen that, you can go to YouTube and watch it. But yeah, that's a good idea, Gary. I like it.
Thank you.
Okay, and with that, once again, Fletcher, on behalf of everybody here, thank you so very much for spending this time with us and sharing your thoughts, your feelings, your wisdom, etc. So thank you.
Thanks for the invitation. Let's stay in touch.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you so much, Fletcher.